The void stretched infinitely, a silent abyss riddled with the debris of forgotten wars. Among the drifting wreckage of shattered fleets, an ancient relic lay hidden, one that should never have existed. The Leviathan cannon, an artifact of impossible power, slumbered in the hollowed ruins of a long-dead civilization. Encased within the skeletal remains of a Dyson sphere, it was a weapon born of desperation, sealed away with the solemn vow that no living being would ever wield its wrath again. Commander Elias Vance had spent the better part of his career on the edge of known space, stationed at Outpost Theta, decrepit listening post tasked with one singular purpose: to ensure the cannon remained a relic of the past. It was a lonely existence punctuated by bureaucratic tedium, outdated equipment, and the quiet paranoia that one day someone would come looking for the weapon. No one ever had. Until now. The distress call came without warning. A garbled transmission, laced with static and desperation, flickered through the comms array. The automated systems barely managed to piece together the final words of the dying crew. The Kryn no. For a moment, silence reigned. Then came the first impact. The outpost's outer defenses collapsed almost instantly under the Kryn's assault. The alien empire had long lurked in the shadows, watching, waiting for an opportunity to seize control of the galaxy's deadliest weapon. Their fleet, sleek and angular, cut through the remnants of humanity's meager defenses like a blade through bone. There was no negotiation, no prelude, just the cold, calculating precision of a species bred for conquest. Vance and his crew barely escaped, launching from the station in a stealth corvette, its drives burning toward the only place that mattered now, the ruins that housed the Leviathan cannon. He had read the reports, seen the classified files buried in the depths of military archives. The weapon was not to be touched, not to be activated. But he also knew what the Kryn would do if they got there first. Humanity's fragile grip on existence would be shattered in an instant. As the corvette sped toward the ruins, the reality of their situation settled over the crew like a suffocating weight. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and racing against an enemy that had already proven itself relentless. Dr. Celine Arkham, the mission's lead scientist, was already scanning the ancient data logs, her face pale as the fragmented records of the cannon's builders scrolled before her eyes. They didn't just seal it away, she murmured, barely audible over the hum of the ship's engines. They were afraid of it. Vance's grip tightened around the console. Afraid? The Leviathan cannon wasn't just another doomsday device. It was something worse, something they didn't understand. And yet, as the looming Kryn warships lit up his sensors, one thought dominated his mind. If humanity was going to survive, he might have to fire it. The corvette shuddered as it broke through the outer edge of the ruined Dyson sphere. Vance's eyes locked onto the viewport, scanning the remnants of the once mighty construct. Its fractured rings were covered in the scars of time, jagged remnants of an ancient race's attempt to build the greatest weapon ever conceived. But now, it was little more than a tomb for forgotten gods. "We're almost there," Vance said, his voice steady despite the weight pressing down on him. He kept his eyes fixed on the starry void, feeling the old machine groan under his command. Every second counted now. The Kryn fleet was fast behind them, a cold reminder that this mission wasn't just about survival, it was about whether humanity could hold on to its place in the galaxy. Dr. Celine Arkham, sitting across from him, was already running diagnostics on the ship's fading systems. Her face was a mask of concentration, but her eyes betrayed a different story. A quiet fear, a recognition of the power they were heading toward. Power no one was truly ready for. "We're not just dealing with the Kryn here," she muttered, tapping a few buttons on her terminal. "The records we've uncovered. This weapon, it's more than a superweapon, it's..." She paused, her voice catching in her throat. "It's a time bomb, and we've just handed the keys to the universe to the wrong people." Vance didn't respond. He couldn't. The ship's course was locked in. The Leviathan cannon awaited, its dormant energy just begging for anyone to awaken it. They reached the cannon's hideout an hour later, the corvette's engines silent as it coasted into the shadow of the massive structure. The hull of the Dyson sphere loomed like a mausoleum, its disrepair more a warning than a tomb. No one had come to reclaim the weapon in over 1,000 years. But now, with the Kryn bearing down on them, it was humanity's last hope, and, maybe its greatest curse. As they docked, the hatch opened to a darkness so deep it felt like it swallowed the very air. Celine led the way, her steps echoing in the hollow corridors. The space was colder than it should have been, a sterile chill that sent a ripple of unease through Vance. The silence was oppressive, the kind that made every small sound seem unnaturally loud. Security systems should still be functional, Celine said. The cannon was supposed to be untouched by time, by all of it. Her fingers traced the ancient symbols etched into the walls. But there's a catch. Vance turned to face her. A catch? They didn't just hide the weapon, Commander, she said, her voice tight with the weight of her words. They locked it away in a cage, an interface only they could access. No one else is supposed to pull the trigger. And if anyone tries... If anyone tries? Vance repeated, his gaze sharpening. There's no telling what will happen, she finished quietly. This weapon didn't just destroy, it rewrote reality itself. The room before them lit up, hums of ancient power slowly awakening. The walls seemed to pulse, like the building was alive. The cannon, that monstrous construct, loomed ahead of them, gleaming black and blue, impossibly vast. It looked less like a weapon and more like a wound in the fabric of space itself. Vance stared at the terminal, a strange flicker of recognition running through him. The warning Celine had uncovered echoed in his mind. The weapon bends time. It corrupts fate. This wasn't just a weapon, he murmured. It was a last resort. A crackle of static interrupted his thoughts. The comms panel blinked and a distorted voice filled the room. The Kryn fleet had arrived. We'll have to move quickly, Celine said, fear creeping into her voice. We can't risk them getting to the weapon before we do. If the Kryn activate it. She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Vance nodded grimly. There was no room for hesitation. They were standing on the precipice of something far beyond their understanding. He motioned for his team to get into position, but as he walked toward the interface, his fingers hovered over the controls. He knew what needed to be done, but a cold knot formed in his stomach. This could be the end of everything. The Kryn had no idea what they were about to unleash, but Vance could feel it. The weapon's pulse vibrated beneath his skin, sending tendrils of dread crawling down his spine. And as the countdown on his terminal ticked downward, he couldn't shake them, feeling that the worst part was yet to come. As the Kryn closed in on their position, Vance made his decision. Get ready, he said. It's time to wake up the monster. The Kryn fleet was relentless, their warships carving through the darkness of space like sharks hunting their prey. Vance watched their approach on the monitors, feeling the weight of every second pressing in on him. Time was no longer a luxury he could afford. The Leviathan cannon pulsed in the background, its energy slowly building to a crescendo, as if it could feel the approaching threat, could sense the destruction in the air. Commander, Dr. Cellini, Arkham said, her voice strained. We don't have much time. If the Kryn gain access to this weapon, they'll annihilate everything we know. But there's something else we need to consider. The cannon. Vance turned his gaze to her, his brow furrowing. What are you talking about? It's not just about firing it, she explained. The weapon's built to alter more than just physical reality. It rewrites the very fabric of time. The last time it was activated, an entire civilization vanished. Erased. As if they never existed. And we're standing here, debating whether we should fire it. Vance's heart raced, the full weight of what they were about to unleash settling on him. And if we don't fire it, the Kryn will get their hands on it and destroy everything. Celine nodded grimly. I know, but I'm not sure we understand the true cost of what we're about to do. If we activate this cannon, we might not just be fighting to save humanity. We could be playing with something much darker than we realize. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of their mission settling like a dark cloud over them. They had been trained for combat, for survival, for facing down the deadliest enemies in the galaxy. But this was beyond anything they'd ever been prepared for. Vance stood motionless, his mind racing. The stakes were far higher than he'd ever imagined. If he pulled the trigger, there was no going back. Not only would it change the course of humanity's future, but it could destroy everything they had fought for. And if the Kryn fired it first, the galaxy would burn, and they wouldn't just lose the war, they would lose everything. "Celine," Vance said, his voice steady, "I need to know we're doing the right thing." "Are we ever sure of the right thing?" she replied quietly, her fingers hovering over the control panel as she double-checked the calculations. "Sometimes the decision is made for us by the universe. We can't go back." The Kryn warships were closing in, their arrival marked by the ominous blip on the sensors. Vance could feel it, their cold, methodical approach, as if they already knew the outcome of this fight. No second chances, no room for mistakes. "Commander, we're running out of time," said Lieutenant Corrin, the ship's weapons officer. He was a no-nonsense type, his eyes locked on the targeting system. "If we're going to stop them, we have to act now." Vance gripped the edge of the control panel, staring at the countdown ticking down in front of him. The weapon was ready. The Kryn were nearly here, and he had a decision to make. He thought about humanity, their resilience, their ability to adapt, to survive against impossible odds. He thought about the families on Earth, the colonies that depended on them, the people who had trusted him to make the right choice. And he thought about the unknown, the consequences of activating a weapon that had been sealed away for millennia. But there was no time for doubt now. The Kryn had to be stopped. The Leviathan cannon had to fire. "Prepare to fire," Vance ordered. "We do this for humanity." Celine hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys. "If we do this, there's no turning back." Vance nodded. "I understand." The crew exchanged nervous looks, but there was no room for hesitation now. The Kryn were at their doorstep, and the Leviathan cannon was their only hope. As Vance stepped forward, he gripped the trigger with a calm resolve that masked the storm of emotions inside him. He didn't know if this was the right choice, but it was the only one left. The weapon hummed louder, its energy building to a deafening roar as the countdown reached its final seconds. Outside, the Kryn warships came into full view, massive and imposing, their sleek hulls gleaming like predators in the dark. But it wasn't the Kryn ships that Vance focused on. It was the Leviathan cannon, the monster they had awoken. The weapon's core pulsed like a heartbeat, its ominous glow illuminating the darkness of the chamber. Celine's voice shook, but she spoke with finality. "Commander, do it." Vance took a deep breath, his finger hovering over the button. He felt the weight of the decision, the lives of his crew, the fate of humanity, all hanging in the balance. With a final, decisive movement, his finger pressed down on the trigger. The universe held its breath. The Leviathan cannon fired. The moment the trigger was pulled, time itself seemed to warp. The cannon's energy rippled outward, radiating with an intensity that shook the very foundation of reality. The ship's hull groaned under the strain as the pulse of energy shot through the Dyson sphere, bursting outward in a beam that was too bright, too fierce for any human to comprehend. For a split second, everything went still. Then the universe seemed to fold. Vance felt a crushing weight press down on him, as though every particle of his being was being stretched across the fabric of space. His vision blurred, the chamber around him flickering between moments as if reality itself had been torn and stitched back together in an instant. The walls of the chamber bent like reflections in a shattered mirror, distorting the crew, the cannon, and even the stars outside. His heart raced, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the blinding flash of energy that seemed to fracture the space-time continuum itself. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the power system struggling to recalibrate. But the silence was different now. Deep, unnerving. The world outside had changed. It was no longer the war-torn battlefield they had known. Instead, Vance found himself staring at a sky he didn't recognize, a sky filled with stars that should not have been there. What the hell just happened? Celine gasped, her voice trembling as she checked the systems. This isn't right. This isn't how it was supposed to work. Vance's mind was reeling, but his eyes remained fixed on the new sky that stretched beyond the Dyson sphere's decaying shell. The stars were different, arranged in a pattern that made no sense. He felt the air around him, the subtle vibrations of the ship beneath his boots. But nothing felt the same. It was as if they had crossed some invisible boundary between realities, stepping into a version of the universe that had never existed before. "Commander, look at the sensors," Lieutenant Corrin said, his voice thick with disbelief. "The Kryn fleet, they're gone. There's no trace of them anywhere." The crew scrambled to process what had happened. The Kryn warships that had been moments away from storming the chamber were now just gone. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. As Vance stared at the screens, his blood ran cold. The Leviathan cannon had fired, yes. But instead of unleashing its destructive fury on the Kryn, it had done something else. Something much more disturbing. A ripple passed through the space around them, like a tremor that shook not the physical world, but the very fabric of time itself. The ship's navigational system blinked erratically, as if it could no longer recognize the timeline they were in. Then came the final confirmation. "We are not in the same place," Celine murmured, her eyes widening in horror. "We're not even in the same timeline. The weapon, it changed everything." Vance's stomach churned. The cannon didn't just stop the Kryn, it had erased them from history. And in doing so, it had rewritten the very essence of the universe itself. He didn't know how or why, but the world around them was now something entirely different. "Captain, there's something else," Corrin said, his voice shaking. "We're not the only ones here. The system. We've detected an unknown fleet. It's huge." Vance turned, staring at the new fleet displayed on the sensors. This was no fleet of Kryn ships. It was something far more advanced, far more alien. They were massive, their shapes unlike anything human or Kryn technology had ever seen. The ships were a kaleidoscope of dark metals and shimmering iridescent energy fields, drifting silently toward the outpost. They weren't enemies from a past war. They weren't Kryn, or even humans from another timeline. These were beings, unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. And they were not here to negotiate. "Set shields to maximum," Vance ordered, his voice a quiet whisper, though his heart was hammering in his chest. "Prepare for engagement." Celine's hands were trembling on the console as she ran diagnostics. "They've already detected us," she said, her eyes wide with shock. "And they're communicating with us. But it's not a language we can understand." The unknown fleet loomed closer, their ships gathering like a storm cloud on the horizon. Vance's mind raced. Were they hostile? Were they a product of the new reality the cannon had created? Or were they always here, hidden in the folds of time, waiting for the universe to shift so they could reveal themselves? Vance could feel the sweat gathering on his brow, the oppressive weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. He'd done it. He'd pulled the trigger. But he hadn't just changed the outcome of a battle. He had altered the entire universe. And now, as the unknown ships approached, he realized that the war he had just begun to fight had no rules, no certainty. They were no longer fighting the Kryn, the enemies they had always known. They were fighting something that didn't belong in this universe. Or maybe they were the ones who didn't belong. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a low, vibrating hum, the ship's sensors coming to life once again, detecting something even more terrifying than the fleet. A presence, something that wasn't a ship, wasn't even material. It was a consciousness, vast and ancient, reaching out to them through the fabric of space. The calm voice echoed through the ship's speakers, its tone both serene and utterly alien. "You were never meant to exist in this reality. Your species is an anomaly. Prepare for eradication." Vance's breath caught in his throat as the weight of those words settled into his chest. The fate of humanity, their entire existence, now rested in the hands of beings who had already declared their intent to erase them from the very fabric of time. And for the first time in his life, Commander Elias Vance realized the horrifying truth. The battle for humanity's survival had just begun. The strange alien fleet hung in the vastness of space, their ships glimmering like distant stars, their presence an unyielding reminder that they were not just outgunned, they were out of place. The warning that had reverberated through the ship's speakers was still ringing in Vance's ears. Prepare for eradication. The moment those words landed, a chill washed over the crew, far colder than the frozen vacuum outside. The cold truth was clear. The Kryn were no longer the threat. They had been swept aside by the fabric of reality itself, and in their place stood something older, something incomprehensible, beings that had existed long before humanity's time and whose motives were as alien as the galaxies they hailed from. "Shields up to maximum," Vance barked, his voice carrying the gravity of the moment. His fingers flew over the control panel, adjusting their defensive systems, though he knew it was futile. These new beings, whoever they were, had already shown that they could manipulate time itself. Conventional weapons, human ingenuity, would be little more than distractions in the face of such power. Celine was at her terminal, her face pale, with fear but resolute. "Commander, the fleet is moving into position, but it's not like anything we've encountered before. Their weapon systems, they're not even registering as energy-based. This is something else." Vance ran his fingers through his hair, his thoughts a tangled mess of disbelief and dread. He had always known that the Leviathan cannon was more than just a weapon, but he had never imagined this. He had triggered a cataclysmic event, a tear in time and space that had not only erased the Kryn, but had also opened the door to something far worse. "Any way to communicate?" Vance asked, his voice calmer than he felt. His mind was still reeling, but he knew there was no time to waste. They had to try to understand who or what these beings were, what they wanted, and most importantly, if there was any way to survive them. Celine glanced up at him, her face a mixture of determination and unease. "I'm trying. The language they're using, it's not structured like anything we know. But there's a pattern, a rhythm to it. I might be able to triangulate a transmission." As Celine worked, Vance turned to Corin, who was staring out at the alien fleet. The lieutenant's face was etched with the same grim realization that had begun to sink into Vance's own bones. "We can't outrun them, can we?" Corin asked, his voice hollow. Vance shook his head. "No, but we're not giving up without a fight. We'll do what we can, buy ourselves time." Before Corin could respond, the ship lurched violently, a jolt of energy shaking every corner of the hull. The lights flickered, alarms blaring. It was a warning shot, but it was enough to send a surge of adrenaline through the crew. "They're testing our defenses," Celine said, her fingers flying over the console. "They're measuring us. We need to respond, but I don't know how to fight something like this." Vance's jaw tightened. "Then we'll have to outthink them." Suddenly, the calm, alien voice echoed once more, resonating throughout the ship, its presence looming like a weight on their minds. "Your existence here is a distortion. We will correct it." Vance's heart raced, but his mind sharpened. There was something in that phrase, something in the way the voice spoke. A distortion. That was their reality now, wasn't it? They were a remnant of a history that never should have existed, a consequence of tampering with something they couldn't understand. "Celine," Vance said, his voice firm. "Is there any way we can alter the parameters of the Leviathan cannon? Can we reverse what we did?" Celine looked up at him, her face pale but filled with the spark of resolve. "I'm not sure. I think the weapon is designed to be a one-way tool. Once it fires, the changes are irreversible. But I can try something. It won't be easy, and it may not work. But it could buy us time." Vance felt the weight of that decision, a desperate gamble. He looked out at the alien ships again, their dark forms hanging like predators waiting for the kill. Humanity's future was hanging by a thread, And he wasn't sure they had the time to make this work. We don't have a choice. Do it. Whatever it takes. Celine nodded, her fingers moving with newfound determination. The console hummed as she accessed the ancient data files, tracing the weapon's complex matrix. A tense silence settled over the crew, every breath drawn, in unison, as if the ship itself held its breath. Then Celine spoke. I've found something, some sort of fail-safe code embedded in the system. If I can reprogram it, I might be able to rewrite the weapon's core parameters, redirect the energy flow, maybe even reverse the ripple. Vance's stomach twisted. It sounded impossible, but it was their only shot. Do it. Celine's fingers flew across the console, a blur of motion. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but she didn't falter. Every moment that passed, Vance could feel the presence of the alien fleet looming closer. But he also felt a flicker of hope. Humanity had survived worse. They could survive this. As the countdown began, a new tension gripped the crew. Would it work? Could they undo the damage they had caused? Or had they gone too far? And then, just as the alien fleet prepared to make its final strike, the ship's systems came to life, humming with a newfound energy. Celine's face broke into a relieved smile, her eyes filled with exhaustion but triumph. We've done it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've reprogrammed the weapon. We can control the energy flow now. But there's a catch. Vance's heart raced. What catch? The final alien transmission came again, but this time there was a shift in its tone, a hint of hesitation, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before. You have altered the course of history, human. But you are not the only ones who can manipulate the fabric of reality. We will not eradicate you now. But know this. Your presence here is an anomaly, and anomalies must be watched. The fleet began to withdraw, slowly but decisively. The threat had not disappeared, but it had shifted. Vance didn't know if humanity had won, but they had bought themselves something more valuable than survival. They had bought time. As the alien ships retreated into the dark expanse of space, Vance let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The universe was still out there, full of unknowns, full of risks. But for now, humanity had a chance to live, to rebuild, and to face whatever came next. They had made it through. For today, at least, that was enough. But Vance couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Leviathan cannon had been activated, and with it the universe had changed. They weren't the only ones aware of the fabric of time's malleability now. Humanity had made its mark. But whether that mark would be erased or remembered remained to be seen. The ship drifted silently in space, the alien fleet now nothing more than a dark shadow on the edge of their sensors. Vance stood at the helm, staring out into the starry abyss, his mind racing. The universe was still there, but it had shifted. The ripples of the cannon's shot would echo through history, and who knew what else they had disturbed. We need to send a message, he said, turning toward Celine. To the colonies, to Earth. We've survived, but we're not the only ones who know what we've done. We need to prepare. They'll be watching. Celine nodded, her fingers already moving over the console. A new chapter begins, Commander. One way or another, we'll face it. The message began to transmit. Quiet, uncertain, but the words were clear. Humanity is no longer alone in this reality, and we will not go quietly into the unknown.